so I'm just going to quickly run through a lot of the gear I'm using and why. I'm using this Ibanez Grooveline Bass. Now, in the past, I've always been more of a traditional passive bass type player, which I still am, but a lot of the work I do requires like in-ears things. I'm talking about theater work. Specifically, if you're at the pit at the Teatro for 3 months, you need a bass that you know A is going to play in tune every night, and B is never going to hum on you. Now, passive basses, while I love them, they almost always have some sort of interference in that type of thing. So I've eventually settled on this bass. Now, I came via this bass via at least 5 or 6 5-string jazz basses. I love the Fender tone, but I've never enjoyed their B-string. I've had 3 Music Man Stingrays, 1 4 and 2 5s. At least 4 different variations of Warwick basses. The reason I've settled on this is because to me tone is an evolving thing. This might not be my favorite bass in 5 years time, but I've had this one for well over a year now, which is the longest I've had just one bass, because I actually only have this 5-string bass for 2 reasons. Firstly, the electronics are very quiet, so I'm running it in passive mode, but it's still got side-by-side humbuckers. So unless you've got very bad wiring and there's nothing you can do, you get virtually no 60 cycle hum. Plus it has a great sounding jazzish passive tone, which I can then augment with the preamp. Now, I'm not a big fan of the active sound, I must be honest. I prefer a passive sound, but this is useful for if you want to solo, or if you want to go for if you want a nice slapping sound that you can just dial out again. So that's what I look for in a bass. Now, there's plenty of basses that offer this. This is just the one that sounds the nicest to me. It's also, I didn't like it at first because I think it looks a bit like a fish, but it's designed that way so that it's perfectly balanced. Your hand is never holding it up. So having said that, I still love a 4-string jazz bass and a 4-string Music Man to me, and a 4-string P bass. Now, an interesting thing about tone is this. A lot of guys say, I only want a P bass tone, I only want this. I like a bass that can get a few tones. So when you want a P bass sound, I like the fact that because it's a humbucker, you're getting that. You're still getting a bit of that grindy mid-range. I find sometimes if the pickups are too hi-fi, you lose a lot of that ugliness in the sound. And for me, a P bass really does sound horrible on its own, but there's nothing like it in a mix. And it's based on that, I've discovered that a lot of bass players really like that scoop mid sound. I'm not a fan of that because certain amps have that baked in. You plug in and straight away you got that scoop mid. Man, it sounds great on its own, but it disappears in a mix like you won't believe. So you'll find a lot of guys with stacks bigger than this, with the amp past 8, and the sound guy's going, man, you're rattling the stage, it's feeding into the microphone, and the guy will go, I can't hear myself, because your mid-range has been compromised. So always think about your mid-range if you want to be heard. Generally, if I'm at a gig and I want to hear more top end, I'll boost the high mids, not the treble frequencies. And if I want a bit more rumble, I'll first start at the low mids, not the bass. Preferably, I like to run an amp flat. So that settled me on the Warwick LWA 1000. Great looking amp. It looks like your grandfather's hi-fi, which I think is pretty cool, with the wood side blocks. But what's 2 things that are really cool about this: two-channel design, which is not a new thing. There's been other amps, but you can either run it independently. In other words, you can run one channel and have another bass in here and mute them. I mean, I cannot tell you how many times you've been on a stage and you've wanted to, you're sharing a stage with 3 other bass players, you want to unplug, and now you're stuck. Something simple like a mute switch goes a long way. But more importantly, you can either use one bass and use both channels, so have 2 different preamps or EQ setup. There's a special splitter plug they use for that. I oftentimes use this either for my electric upright or my acoustic upright bass. Then you've got 2 different gain settings and you've got 2 different EQ settings. What I like about this amp is when you plug into it, it doesn't jump out at you as, wow, lots of bass, lots of treble, hear me roar. It's quite a neutral sounding preamp. And if I turn the compressor off, it loses a bit of its teeth. The compressor really gives it a nice glassy tone and a little bit of a treble boost, and it doesn't actually act like a traditional compressor because it very rarely, the ratio must be set and the threshold must be set quite high because it very rarely sounds like it's squashing your notes. This was designed by one of my bass heroes called Jonas Hellborg, and he designed this amp rig called the Hellborg rig, which used ridiculous components. I mean, he was talking about things I didn't even understand, coil inducted EQ and, you know, Jensen this and your mother's that. But they retailed for $15,000. I don't think anyone has ever reached this shore. So what Warwick did is they asked him to design a cheaper version that could be manufactured and sold at a reasonable price point. So I got this one from Stuart here at Marshall Music. And what his thing is, he wants his amp to sound like his bass, but louder. Okay, so he doesn't want a particular EQ curve. That's what he's got a 4-band EQ for. So I really like this. I generally take this alone to gigs because quite often, certainly festival gigs, and I've even used this sometimes as a recording interface. I just turn the output down. I'll often plug this into, for example, an existing cab, and the difference with the people on stage who are used to the other thing is quite palpable, because what I like about this amp is that it doesn't color your sound and it gets your sound out there, but I mean, you can literally, like with every other amp, if you boost things ridiculously, you will get a big EQ sweep, but it actually really just, it's your bass but louder. And I find that this thing just cuts through a mix. I mean, I've been, before this I did use Mark bass gear for a long time, and I still really like them. I like their cabs in particular. Aguilar stuff is great too, but this particular amp is just something that I've really come to appreciate. Following on from this, I also use, thanks to Marshall Music and Stuart, DR bass strings. Now bass strings, a lot of people are, it's a much of a muchness, isn't it? But there's obvious, or rather I would say there's small differences that aren't maybe that obvious. For example, DR bass strings are compression wound, which means they wind them around the core, and they're usually a round core, not a hexagonal core. That means when they wind them, there's not that little air gap between the string and the core that you get on other strings. So they wind them very tightly onto a round core, and then they take some sort of machine and they crush them, so they feel smoother. A lot of times when you're playing a steel string in particular, it's very rough on the fingers, and more importantly, it's rough on your frets. So you'll find yourself after a while having to do a lot more fret dresses if you use steel strings, because your strings are far more durable than your frets. So the DR system is that they compression wound these things so that they last longer, because there's less sweat going in between the windings of the string, plus the string is wound tightly onto the core, not onto a hexagonal thing where dirt and dust and everything can get. The in conclusion is they sound brighter for longer. Even their steel strings, when they come out the pack, unless you order the Sunbeams, which are their brightest ones, they come out sounding relatively mellow. In other words, they don't sound brand new, but they stay that way for much longer. And me not being a fan of traditional, how shall we call them, traditional wrapped strings or coated strings, because no matter how thin they try to make that coating, I always hear a high-end roll-off. These strings have a similar shelf life with a natural string feel and sound. So, yeah, I've been through Dodarias, been through virtually every type of Ernie Ball known to man, a lot of GHS as well, and now I exclusively use DRs simply because they sound better, they last longer, and they feel better to play. Never mind sound, they chew up your strings, your frets less, they chew up your fingers less, and yeah, they just make it more fun to play.